July 7, 1968. St. Martin's Episcopal Church, Harlem. The pews were packed with hundreds of mourners. Politicians sat in the front rows, their faces solemn. Jazz legends stood along the walls, some with tears streaming down their faces. Community leaders filled every available space, paying their respects to a man who had ruled Harlem for over 2 decades. But in the very back of the church, almost hidden behind a massive marble column, stood a man nobody expected to see. Frank Lucas. Frank hadn't been seen in Harlem for 3 years. Most people thought he was dead. Some thought he'd fled to Mexico. Others believed he'd been killed and dumped in the Hudson River. But there he was, watching, waiting. He stayed perfectly still as hundreds of people filed past the closed mahogany casket. He watched as Bumpy Johnson's family wept. He watched as old friends placed their hands on the polished wood and whispered their goodbyes. And when the church finally emptied, when only a handful of family members and close friends remained near the front, Frank Lucas moved. He walked slowly down the center aisle, his hands trembling. He reached the casket and knelt down on the cold marble floor. He leaned close to where Bumpy's face rested beneath the mahogany lid, and his lips began to move. He wasn't praying. He was begging. "I'm sorry," he whispered, so quietly that even the people 10 feet away couldn't hear him. "God, I'm so sorry. You were right about everything. Please forgive me." Tears ran down Frank's face as he whispered to a dead man, begging for forgiveness for something that happened 3 years earlier. Something so unforgivable that Frank Lucas, who would go on to build a $1 million per day heroin empire and become one of the most powerful criminals in American history, had run from Harlem and stayed away for 3 full years. Something that made him come back only when he knew Bumpy Johnson could never punish him again. This is the story of Frank Lucas's unforgivable sin, the betrayal that even the movie American Gangster was too scared to show. To understand why Frank Lucas was on his knees begging a corpse for forgiveness, you need to go back 3 years to 1965, to the moment Frank Lucas committed the one sin that Bumpy Johnson could never, ever forgive. Frank Lucas was born in North Carolina in 1930. He came to Harlem in 1946, 16 years old with nothing but rage and hunger. He had watched the Ku Klux Klan murder his cousin in front of him when he was just 6 years old. That kind of trauma doesn't leave you. It shapes you. It makes you dangerous. Frank worked his way up through the ranks. He started as a numbers runner, carrying betting slips and cash through the streets of Harlem. Then he moved to muscle work, collecting debts for loan sharks, making sure people paid what they owed. By the early 1960s, he was doing protection rackets, making sure businesses stayed safe in exchange for weekly payments. He was making decent money, enough to eat well and dress sharp. But decent wasn't enough for Frank Lucas. He didn't want to be comfortable. He wanted to be rich. He wanted to be feared. He wanted to be untouchable. In 1964, Frank went to Vietnam, not as a soldier, as an entrepreneur. While other men saw a war, Frank Lucas saw an opportunity that nobody else was seeing. The war had created a massive drug pipeline from Southeast Asia straight into America. The Italian mafia controlled the entire operation. They bought heroin from suppliers in the Golden Triangle, the region where Thailand, Burma, and Laos met. Then they shipped it back to the States, cut it 5 or 6 times with quinine and lactose, and sold it on the streets for massive profits. Frank thought, why pay the middlemen? Why not go straight to the source? He made connections in Thailand with a supplier named Chun Lee. He negotiated directly with the people who actually grew and processed the opium. He arranged for pure, uncut heroin to be smuggled back to the United States in the coffins of dead American soldiers. It was brilliant. It was ruthless. It was absolutely unforgivable. When Frank got back to Harlem in early 1965, he was ready to revolutionize the entire drug game. He had the purest heroin product that New York City had ever seen. He could undercut the Italian mob's prices by 30% and still make an absolute fortune. He had his territory already picked out. 116th Street, right in the heart of Harlem. He had his brand ready. He was going to call it Blue Magic. He had his distribution network lined up. Hungry young dealers who would do anything for the kind of money Frank was offering. Everything was absolutely perfect. There was just one problem. One rule that Frank was about to break. One man who would make him pay for it in ways Frank couldn't even imagine. Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson was 59 years old in 1965. He had been the undisputed king of Harlem for 20 years. He ran the numbers rackets, pulling in thousands of dollars every single week from illegal gambling operations. He controlled the protection rackets, making sure businesses stayed safe and paid their dues. He settled disputes between criminals, between gangs, between anyone who had a problem in Harlem. But most importantly, Bumpy Johnson had one unbreakable rule. No hard drugs in Harlem. Not heroin. Not in his neighborhood. Bumpy had watched heroin destroy entire cities. He had seen what it did in Chicago, where whole neighborhoods turned into wastelands of addiction. He had watched it happen in Detroit, where mothers abandoned their babies for their next fix. He had seen it devastate Philadelphia, where kids as young as 14 were dying in alleyways with needles still in their arms. He had watched families collapse, neighborhoods rot from the inside out, communities that had been strong and proud turn into ghost towns filled with walking corpses. And Bumpy Johnson had made a promise to Harlem. Not here. Never here. Everyone who operated in Harlem knew the rule. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a guideline. It was law. The Italian mafia respected it. They sold heroin everywhere else in New York City. Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens, Staten Island, all of it was fair game. But not Bumpy's territory. Not Harlem. Local dealers knew it. Street-level criminals knew it. Even the police knew it. If you wanted to work in Harlem, if you wanted to make money in Bumpy Johnson's neighborhood, you followed Bumpy's rules. Period. But Frank Lucas didn't care about rules. He cared about money. Frank set up his operation in complete secrecy. He didn't announce it. He didn't advertise. He didn't ask for permission or forgiveness. He just moved. He recruited a network of young dealers, kids between 17 and 22 years old, who were desperate enough and hungry enough to take the risk. Kids who wanted to be like Frank, who wanted the clothes and the cars and the respect that money could buy. Frank started selling Blue Magic on 116th Street. Within 2 weeks, he was making $50,000 per week. In 1965, that was an unbelievable, almost incomprehensible amount of money. He was selling pure heroin at prices that made the Italian mob's cut product look like an absolute joke. Customers started flooding in from all over New York City. Word spread like wildfire. The best heroin in the city. The purest product. The best prices. Blue Magic. But here's what made Frank's operation truly unforgivable. Frank didn't just break Bumpy's rule. He sold heroin to Harlem's kids. The same children that Bumpy Johnson had sworn to protect. Young men who looked up to Frank Lucas, who wanted to be like him, who saw him as a success story. Mother's sons who were turning into addicts within weeks of their first hit. Frank Lucas was poisoning the very neighborhood that Bumpy had protected for 20 years. This wasn't just business. This wasn't just breaking a rule. This was betrayal. It took exactly 11 days for word to reach Bumpy Johnson. A mother came to his apartment, tears streaming down her face. Her 19-year-old son was strung out on heroin. He had bought it from one of Frank's dealers on 116th Street. The boy had been a good kid, had a job at the post office, was saving money for college. Now he was stealing from his own mother to buy his next fix. Bumpy's face went stone cold when he heard this. He asked the woman for her son's name, told her he would handle it, and sent her home. Then he made a phone call. But Bumpy Johnson didn't storm into Frank's operation with guns blazing. He didn't send shooters to 116th Street. He didn't order a hit or plan a war. He did something that terrified Frank Lucas more than any gun ever could. He invited Frank to lunch. They met at Wells Restaurant, the same place where Bumpy Johnson would collapse from a heart attack and die 3 years later. It was a Tuesday afternoon, around 2 o'clock. The lunch rush had ended and the place was quiet. Just the two of them, sitting at a corner table near the window. Bumpy ordered breakfast food even though it was 2 in the afternoon. Eggs, bacon, toast, orange juice. He always ate breakfast food. It was his thing. Frank Lucas ordered coffee. Just coffee. His hands were trembling too much to even think about eating. "I hear you've been busy, Frank," Bumpy said, cutting into his eggs with the side of his fork. His voice was calm, almost friendly. Frank tried to play it cool. Just trying to make a living, Mr. Johnson. You know how it is. Making a living is fine, Frank. I respect hustle. I respect ambition. But you're selling heroin on 116th Street. In my neighborhood. Frank took a sip of his coffee, trying to steady his nerves. It's good business, Mr. Johnson. People want it. There's demand. I'm just providing what they're asking for. Bumpy set his fork down on the plate. The sound of metal on ceramic echoed in the quiet restaurant. His voice stayed perfectly calm, but something in his eyes changed. Something cold and dangerous moved behind them. Frank, I'm going to give you some advice, and I'm only going to say this once. Stop selling that poison in Harlem. Take your business to Brooklyn. Take it to the Bronx. Take it to Queens. I don't care where you go, but not here. Not in my neighborhood. With all due respect, Mr. Johnson, that's old thinking. This is the future. This is progress. This is what people want, and This is your first warning. Bumpy interrupted. His voice didn't rise. He didn't get loud or angry. He just spoke over Frank like he was nothing. I'm giving you this warning out of respect for the work you've done over the years. You're a smart kid. You've got potential. Don't make me give you a second warning. Frank Lucas should have listened. Any other man in Harlem would have listened. Any other dealer, any other hustler, any other criminal in the entire city would have heard those words and understood that their life was on the line. But Frank was 35 years old, making more money than he had ever seen in his entire life. And he was convinced that he was smarter than everyone else in the room. He was convinced that Bumpy Johnson was too old to understand how the game had changed. Frank kept selling. 2 weeks later, Bumpy called Frank again. Same restaurant. Same corner table by the window. But this time, Bumpy wasn't polite. This time, his voice was ice. I told you to stop. Mr. Johnson, I hear you. I respect you. I really do. But this is business. I'm not hurting anybody who doesn't want to be hurt. Not hurting anybody. Bumpy's voice dropped dangerously low. Frank pressed forward, trying to justify himself. People are going to buy drugs whether I sell them or someone else does. That's just reality. At least I'm keeping the money in the community. At least it's staying with us instead of going to the Italians. That last line was Frank's fatal error. Bumpy's jaw tightened. His knuckles went white where he gripped his fork. Keeping the money in the community, Bumpy repeated slowly, letting each word hang in the air. Frank, do you know what heroin actually does? It doesn't just hurt the person using it. It destroys entire families. It turns mothers into addicts who can't feed their babies, who can't take care of their children, who abandon everyone they love for one more hit. It turns young men into thieves and killers who would rob their own grandmothers for $10. It hollows out neighborhoods from the inside. It takes everything that's good and strong about a community and burns it all down. You're not keeping money in the community, Frank. You're burning the community down for profit. That's their choice, Frank said, his voice harder now. I'm not forcing anybody to buy anything. They make their own decisions. You're feeding poison to people who don't know any better. Children, Frank. You're selling to children, and you're doing it in my neighborhood. Your neighborhood? Frank's voice had an edge to it now, a challenge. With all due respect, Mr. Johnson, you don't own Harlem. Times are changing. The old rules don't apply anymore. The game is different now, and the old rules, Bumpy said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, are the only reason you're still breathing right now. Silence fell over the table. Frank stared at Bumpy. Is that a threat, Mr. Johnson? No, Frank. Bumpy's eyes were absolutely empty. No anger. No emotion. Just cold calculation. It's your last warning. Stop now. Walk away. Or you will regret it for the rest of your life. Frank Lucas walked out of that restaurant convinced that Bumpy Johnson was finished. The old man was too old, too soft, too stuck in the past to understand that the game had changed. The world was different now. The old ways didn't work anymore. Money was king, and Frank had more money coming in than Bumpy had seen in years. Frank went back to 116th Street and doubled his operation. He set up 3 more distribution locations. He hired 12 more dealers. He increased his supply orders from Thailand. He was making over $100,000 per week now. Frank Lucas had just made the biggest mistake of his entire life. Bumpy Johnson didn't believe in unnecessary violence. He believed in precision. He believed in strategy. And he was about to teach Frank Lucas a lesson that Frank would never, ever forget. Bumpy Johnson didn't believe in bullets. He believed in pressure. He believed in knowing exactly where to apply force to make an entire system collapse. Frank Lucas's drug operation depended on several key elements: suppliers who provided the product, transportation that got it into the country, distributors who sold it on the streets, protection that kept the police away, and most importantly, trust. Trust that everyone would do their job and keep their mouths shut. If any one of those elements disappeared, the whole thing would fall apart like a house of cards. Bumpy Johnson decided to make them all disappear. It started on a Monday morning. Frank's main heroin supplier in Thailand was a man named Chun Lee. Chun controlled access to several opium farms in the Golden Triangle. He was Frank's entire pipeline. Without Chun Lee, Frank had nothing. Chun Lee had a son who was studying engineering at Columbia University in New York City. The son had a gambling problem. He owed money to several bookies around the city, bookies who worked for Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy made one phone call. Within 24 hours, all of Chun Lee's son's gambling debts were completely forgiven, erased, wiped clean, and it came with a message delivered through one of the bookies. Bumpy Johnson is a friend of your family. He wanted to help. When Chun Lee heard about this, he understood immediately what was happening. This wasn't a favor. This was a warning disguised as a favor. Bumpy was saying, I can reach your family anytime I want. I can help them, or I can hurt them. Choose wisely. Chun Lee stopped taking Frank's calls. On Tuesday, Bumpy handled the transportation problem. Frank was smuggling heroin inside the coffins of dead American soldiers being flown back from Vietnam. It was a brilliant, terrible scheme, but it required cooperation from dozens of people. Military officials who looked the other way, mortuary workers who prepared the bodies, customs agents who didn't inspect certain shipments too carefully. All of them were being paid off by Frank. Bumpy didn't try to pay them more money. He didn't threaten them with violence. He just made sure they understood something very simple. The FBI was watching Frank Lucas. Not actively investigating him yet, just watching, paying attention. And anyone connected to Frank's operation would eventually be connected to a federal case. Bumpy had a friend in the FBI, an agent named Turner, who had grown up in Harlem. Turner didn't leak classified information. He didn't break any rules. He just started asking questions. Casual questions. You know anything about Frank Lucas? We've been hearing his name come up. Just curious. That was all it took. The military officials stopped cooperating. The mortuary workers stopped looking the other way. The customs agents started actually inspecting shipments. The risk wasn't worth the money anymore. By Wednesday, Frank Lucas couldn't get a single gram of heroin into the country. On Thursday, Bumpy destroyed Frank's distribution network. Frank's street dealers were young men, teenagers and 20-year-olds who were loyal to money, not to Frank Lucas. Bumpy sent his people to have quiet conversations with each one of them. Not threats, just information. You know Frank's supplier disappeared, right? You know the feds are asking questions about Frank. You know Frank's not going to be able to protect you when this whole thing falls apart, right? Some dealers quit immediately. They just walked away, disappeared into other neighborhoods, found other ways to make money. Others tried to hold out, tried to stay loyal. But when they saw their colleagues walking away, when they saw the writing on the wall, they followed. Within 48 hours, Frank didn't have a single person willing to sell for him on the streets. By Friday, Bumpy went after the money. Frank had stash houses all over Harlem, apartments where he kept cash, product, and weapons. He had been extremely careful. Only his most trusted associates knew the locations. But Bumpy knew people. He knew landlords who owned buildings. He knew superintendents who saw everyone coming and going. He knew neighbors who paid attention and remembered faces. And Bumpy knew how to ask questions without really asking questions. Bumpy's people didn't rob Frank's stash houses. They didn't break in. They didn't steal anything. They didn't need to. They just made sure the right information got to the right people. Information about lease violations, fire code issues, suspicious activity that needed to be investigated, anonymous tips to the police. Within 1 week, police had raided 3 of Frank's stash house locations. Not because they were specifically targeting Frank Lucas, but because anonymous tips about illegal activity had forced them to act. The cash was confiscated as evidence. The drugs were seized. The weapons were taken. And Frank couldn't even claim any of it without completely incriminating himself. By the following Monday, exactly 1 week after Bumpy Johnson had started, Frank Lucas's entire operation was gone. No suppliers. No way to get product into the country. No dealers willing to sell. No money. No protection. Nothing. And Bumpy Johnson hadn't fired a single shot. Hadn't thrown a single punch. Hadn't made a single direct threat. He had simply applied pressure to every weak point in Frank's system, and the whole thing had collapsed. Frank Lucas sat in his apartment on Tuesday morning, staring at his phone. Nobody was answering his calls. His supplier in Thailand had vanished. His dealers had disappeared. His stash houses were empty. He had $3,000 in his pocket. 1 week ago, he had hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now he had enough money for a bus ticket. And then came the knock on his door. Frank grabbed the gun from his nightstand and approached the door cautiously. His heart was pounding. He didn't know if Bumpy was finally sending someone to kill him, or if this was something else entirely. "Who is it?" Frank called out, his voice shakier than he wanted it to be. "Delivery," a young voice answered. Frank opened the door slowly, gun held behind his back. Standing there was a kid, maybe 16 years old, holding a plain manila envelope. The kid looked terrified. "This is for you, Mr. Lucas," the kid said, shoving the envelope forward. Frank took it. The kid turned and ran down the hallway before Frank could even ask who sent him. Frank closed the door, locked it, and opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single piece of paper. One sentence written in neat, careful handwriting. "You're still breathing. That's your only warning. Leave." No signature. No name. But Frank Lucas knew exactly who it was from. That night, Frank packed a bag. He didn't pack much. Some clothes. The $3,000 he had left. His gun. He got in his car and drove south. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He didn't say goodbye to his dealers, his girls, his friends. He just left. He ended up back in North Carolina, back where he had started nearly 20 years earlier. He got a cheap apartment in Charlotte. He worked odd jobs. Construction work. Loading trucks. Anything that paid cash and didn't ask questions. And every single day, Frank tried to understand what had happened. How had Bumpy Johnson destroyed his entire operation without ever confronting him directly? How had an old man with outdated ideas completely demolished a sophisticated, multi-state drug operation in less than 1 week? How had he lost everything without a single bullet being fired, without a single punch being thrown, without a single direct threat? It took Frank 3 years to finally understand. Bumpy didn't win because he was more violent than Frank. He didn't win because he had more guns or more soldiers or more muscle. He won because he understood something that Frank didn't understand. Power isn't about what you control. It's about what you're connected to. And Bumpy Johnson was connected to everything and everyone in Harlem. He knew the landlords. He knew the police. He knew the FBI agents. He knew the bookies. He knew the dealers. He knew the mothers and the fathers and the children. He knew the system so well that he could take it apart piece by piece, without anyone even realizing what was happening until it was already over. Frank Lucas stayed away from Harlem for 3 full years. He heard news occasionally through people who traveled south. Bumpy was still running things. The neighborhood was stable. There was no heroin epidemic in Harlem like there was in other cities. Bumpy's rule held. And every single day of those 3 years, Frank thought about the warnings he had ignored. He thought about the lunch at Wells' restaurant. He thought about Bumpy's calm voice telling him to stop. He thought about the kids he had poisoned, the mothers he had destroyed, the families he had ruined for profit. The guilt ate at him. Not enough to stop him from wanting to get back into the drug game eventually, but enough to make him understand that what he had done in Harlem was unforgivable. Then on July 7th, 1968, Frank got a phone call from an old friend. Bumpy Johnson was dead. Heart attack at Wells Restaurant. He died eating breakfast. Frank hung up the phone and sat in silence for almost an hour. Then he got in his car and drove north. He wasn't going back to reclaim his territory. He wasn't going to celebrate the death of his enemy. He was going to beg forgiveness from a dead man for the unforgivable sin he had committed 3 years earlier. Frank drove up from North Carolina that same night. He arrived in Harlem early in the morning, hours before the funeral started. He stayed in his car, parked 2 blocks away from St. Martin's Episcopal Church, watching people arrive. When the funeral began, Frank slipped in through the back entrance and stayed hidden behind the marble column. He watched hundreds of people pay their respects. Politicians in their expensive suits, jazz musicians who had known Bumpy for decades, community leaders who owed everything to the man lying in that casket, all of them paying respects to a man who had ruled Harlem not through fear, but through respect, intelligence, and protection. When the crowd finally thinned, when most people had left and only family and close friends remained near the front of the church, Frank Lucas walked down the center aisle. His legs felt weak. His hands were shaking. He reached the casket and looked down at Bumpy's face through the glass panel in the lid. Bumpy looked peaceful, calm, like he was just sleeping. Frank thought about the lunch at Wells Restaurant. He thought about the warnings he had ignored because he thought he was smarter than everyone else. He thought about the kids he had poisoned. He thought about the mothers whose sons he had turned into addicts. He thought about the lesson he had learned far too late. Frank knelt down on the cold marble floor. Tears streamed down his face. He leaned close to the casket and whispered, "I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. You were right about everything. I was a fool. I poisoned your neighborhood. I hurt the kids you spent 20 years protecting. Please, please forgive me." Nobody else heard it. The family members at the front of the church were too far away. But Frank needed to say it. He needed Bumpy to hear it, even if Bumpy was gone. He stayed there on his knees for almost 5 minutes, crying, begging a corpse for forgiveness for the unforgivable. After Bumpy's death, Frank Lucas came back to Harlem. He rebuilt his drug empire from the ground up. He became one of the most powerful heroin dealers in America. He made millions of dollars. His operation eventually grew so large that it supplied drugs to multiple cities up and down the East Coast. But Frank never forgot what Bumpy Johnson taught him. He never sold drugs in schools. He never specifically targeted kids. He always kept some kind of code, some sense of rules, some line he wouldn't cross. It wasn't much. It didn't make him a good person, but it was something. When Frank was finally arrested in 1975, when he was sitting in a federal prison cell thinking about his entire life, he told his lawyer something that revealed just how much Bumpy's lesson had affected him. "The only man I ever truly feared was Bumpy Johnson. Not because of what he did to me, but because of how he did it. He could destroy you without you ever seeing it coming. No guns, no violence, just intelligence and connections. That's real power." That's the lesson Bumpy Johnson taught Frank Lucas in 1965. Power isn't about violence. It's not about how many guns you have or how many people you can hurt. Real power is about knowing the system so well that you can take it apart piece by piece, quietly, efficiently, methodically, without anyone even realizing what's happening until it's already too late. Frank Lucas became famous. There were books written about him. There was a major Hollywood movie made about his life, starring Denzel Washington. Documentaries, interviews. His name became legendary. But the story they never told, the story that didn't make it into American Gangster, was the story of what Frank whispered at Bumpy Johnson's funeral. The story of how Bumpy Johnson made Frank disappear for 3 years without firing a single shot. The story of how one man protected his neighborhood with nothing but intelligence, connections, and one sacred, unbreakable principle. No poison in Harlem,